edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. You know, like a lot of writers, nonfiction writers, I dream of writing a fiction book. I'm not a terribly adept storyteller. I don't tend to think in terms of stories and narratives as much as ideas and environments and concepts. But I still kind of feel like I'm going to be disappointed with myself if I don't try to squeeze out a fiction one of these days. I like the idea of like the writer as a sort of Swiss Army knife who can do different kinds of things. And I've done rock criticism and cultural journalism and technology journalism. And, you know, I wrote a PhD and I wrote a rock opera and I wrote some poetry back in the day. And so I like the idea that at some point I try to write some fiction. But, you know, it's a little tough because I'd have to get a story from somewhere because, as I said, I'm not a natural storyteller. And one of the things people do who write fictions is, of course, you know, steal the stories of their own lives, which in my case are only so interesting because, again, I don't really remember them that well. A lot of my friends remember incidents in my life better than I do, which is maybe one of the reasons I stay close to my friends over time. But another thing you do is you can steal your friends' stories. And if I was going to steal somebody's story and write it, not as if it was my personal story, but write it as a fiction or use it as a basis for a fiction, I would steal my friend Naropa Sabine's story. Let's see, I met Naropa in the early 2000s, I think, and we immediately started talking about Moby Dick, and we had that sort of mutual intoxication along with my wife Jennifer, where you're talking in this way where you just kind of get higher and higher. And he came back to our apartment, and we talked for like and drank alternately alcohol and caffeine for like 3 days. It was quite exhilarating and quite fun. And he knew people that I'd known stretching way back to mysterious freak scenes in, of all places, Memphis, Tennessee. And so I've been enjoying having friends on the show and talking about their life experiences and enjoying the long running conversations that we've had for so long, such a rich part of my life. And so I decided to ask Naropa to come on and talk about his story. And the only real setup I think we need to have is that you hear this name Naropa and you think two things. One, he changed his name because he's some kind of, you know, yogi, wannabe mystic, peaceful warrior thing, you know. Speaking of peaceful warrior, I went to a Michael Pollan talk last night. His new book, How to Change Your Mind, big book on psychedelics. It's going to change the whole discourse, New York Times, the whole thing. Like the shark has definitively jumped. But he's a great guy. I really like Michael a lot. And at the end, somebody asked a question. And the guy said that it was hilarious because Michael's pretty kind of, you know, straight guy, you know, New York Times kind of guy, you know, interested in psychedelics, but he's got his feet on the ground. And then he got these totally classic psychedelic whack job questions. And one of them was this guy who said that he thought see if I get it right. Psychedelics were the samurai sword of the peaceful warrior. So in any case, I don't know why that stuck in my mind. So the peaceful warrior. But so you thought Naropa might be one of those guys, but no, Naropa was named by his parents, and not just any old weird hippie commune parents who named their kids like Sunshine or, you know, Mulch or something like that. Naropa came into this earth as the child of a bona fide guru. And that is the story that we're going to hear about today. So Naropa, thanks so much for joining me on Expanding Mind.
It's a pleasure. Great to be here.
So Naropa, one thing I always imagine when I imagine the story in my head, because I often kind of run it as a sort of film, is that moment in your young life when you realize that the situation that you're living in with the guru dad, you're in an ashram, there's, you know, Hindu religiosity everywhere, was not the conventional lifestyle where you were, which again wasn't even California or even Colorado, but rural Tennessee. So that must have been an interesting awakening.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. I mean, retrospectively, I've had opportunity to really sit with the sort of cultural divide that I had to navigate, which I think was pretty, what would I say? It was significant in determining, the shape of my character, who I became. And basically what I was dealing with was an incredibly rural circumstance, so much so that it was roughly 35, 40 miles to the nearest small town, Sevierville, in Tennessee. And we had purchased, or rather my father had purchased, this land that was incredibly fertile, outrageously beautiful, and just literally in the middle of the mountains. And moved us there basically with, just a little bit of cash and a couple seeds and his ideological crusade, or his system that we were all sort of a part of. And in any case, the point of that being, in the midst of that, my brother and I were attending public school. So a grammar school in Tennessee initially, and I later went to high school there as well. In the grammar school, I think at most had, 60 kids, 80 kids at most. And it was there that I first began to understand that, what was happening at home in no way related to the dominant cultural concerns. Like you talk about maybe California or coastal areas or more progressive parts of the country may have had, been more sympathetic to what we were doing. But I had experiences where literally people asked me what, I said I was a vegetarian, and people did not know what the word meant. And then when I explained that meant I didn't eat meat, then the next question inevitably was, but why? It was inconceivable. So that you had that, there was the vegetarianism, there was, the daily rituals and practice, meditation, the ritualistic aspects, the chanting. So that was going on daily. The fire ceremonies on the weekends. I mean, the entire structure at home revolved around these practices. And then off we went to school. And then there was no traction. I mean, it was just a sort of divide in which, things were just swallowed. There was no connective tissue. So as you can imagine, that was some difficult terrain, especially into high school. And at that age where you're already on a slippery slope in trying to develop a cohesive identity at that age. You're, I think, much more acutely aware of the, what your peers think and societal pressures to sort of conform. And I had a number of tactics to do the best I could, but it was a lonely road for most of those formative years, frankly.
So how old were you when you guys moved to the ashram?
Well, let's see, that would be 7th, 8th grade. I think somewhere maybe 11, 12, right. Somewhere right in there. And we had, prior to that, we had been moving a lot and had spent time in different ashrams and in a lot of, as a peripatetic lifestyle. And I think partially due to my father's relationship to his different teachers. And then at some point, I think he was ready to embark on his own attempt to create this community. I think he'd been authorized at that point by his teachers to make that move. So that's what led to this move to rural Tennessee, and was literally based on seeing an ad in a paper, as I recall, and he pretty much got it sight unseen. I think he said he had a dream, which also, back to the name, apparently that was also a part in how I received my name. Was there was a dream involved, and but he was also in Boulder around 72, which is where I was born. So I don't know how directly his relationship to Trungpa affected that decision, or if he was just it was in the milieu or the zeitgeist,
Yeah, well, I want to come back, of course, to your experiences, but I think it'd be good to give a little backstory on your dad, on Shankaracharya, as he came to be known, and what the sort of spiritual scene was. I mean, his was kind of a classic '60s tale of a freak who finds sort of Eastern religion and then dives right in. But I think it'd be great to just hear a little bit more about his story and then the particular tradition that he got hooked up with and empowered within.
Sure. My understanding is, and as I recall, we moved through a number of ashrams in those early years, as I mentioned. He was a student of Muktananda, and we went to India and stayed in Muktananda's ashram there. And then he was running a center for Muktananda at different points. And then he became involved. There was a while with Keshava Das. There was a stretch. I think, the primary relationship he had was with Jnana Yogi Mahasudan Das, who was a Shaktipat teacher. And we stayed and helped run his ashram in Soquel in California. And that was I know, a very significant part of his practice. And then he also worked with a kind of cave yogi in Kaloo Valley, and still has a relationship with him, and helped actually finance a temple there. So those were the primary relationships. And as you said, it is very much a tale of that era. He had been involved in the psychedelic movement in a pretty fundamental role, as I understand, and in as much as the belief was that LSD was, the holy grail. It was the thing that was going to change the world. So in his version of the events, there was a pretty profound and visceral idealism in their relationship to LSD specifically. And I know that was the center of his life for a while. And he had friends that were, did time that we would visit early on. And my understanding is at some point he had teacher, I think it was specifically Muktananda, who somehow knew intuitively that he had a certain number of hits on him at the time, and told him it was time to leave that life behind and move more into these spiritual practice and tradition. And then soon after, there was a lab explosion in which he was burned severely and thrown into a lake, and had an out-of-body experience, during which time a voice essentially instructed him to go to India. And as I understand it, that was the main kind of, that's when the other path, that's when he took that road. I never saw him drink a glass of wine or smoke a joint or, really imbibe any stimulants from, throughout my entire life, throughout my childhood. But apparently prior to that, this was when he was more involved in that drug culture. And then there was a clean break.
Yeah, and then he moves on to, a particular flavor of Hindu spirituality. When we just throw out a guru name, if you don't actually, if you don't know the playbook and it's just a guru name, you can get a certain image of a, wise old man with a beard and doing yoga and meditating and things like that. But the Shaktipat tradition that was the central current that he picked up on and that he continues to transmit is a very particular flavor. Probably Muktananda was the most famous teacher in the West who is associated with this tradition. And since it has so much to do not only with the particular character of the religious vision, but also like the body and energy and eroticism and power, like these very concrete, quote unquote, tantric forces are at the core of this current, and I see them also in you in very interesting ways as you've come from this background, gone through your own search, your own evolution, your own becoming your own singularity. There's still this sense that there's something very powerful in that tradition, and personally the way that I've touched in it, which is very few times, going to some Muktananda centers when I was in high school. My aunt was a follower of Muktananda, and indeed when I finally met Shankaracharya, there was a similar kind of almost reminiscent charge that I could sort of tap into, if you will. So I'd love to hear you talk about how you came to understand what that tradition was about, and particularly its teachings on the power and energy and the body, and the way that kind of informed the way what you were doing as a kid, like the sadhana, the practices, the breath work, the chants, the fire ceremonies. There was something happening to you internally as well that to my mind is highlighted by this particularly kind of energy rich tantric tradition.
Yeah. Let's see. It's a strange story in that I think that throughout my childhood and well into my mid-20s, it was the backdrop for my life. I didn't have any distance, and not so much distance, but I think that throughout the childhood practices, I wasn't having what I would call direct stirrings of Kundalini or experiences that were visible evidence of these processes. So, and I think that also was a shift in the tone of the ashram itself, which developed later on in the Nashville years, where I think a lot more people in the ashram started having much more intense traditional Shaktipat awakenings. So I guess my point being that throughout my childhood, it was like, you get up, you meditate, you're doing a lot of these mantras, you're doing Hanuman Chalisas, you're doing 108 names of Durga. So these practices were just a sort of daily routine that were normalized. And so, I knew that they were outside the cultural norms, but in terms of my own experience, they had yet to really, affect my sense of self or call into question, my sort of basic experience of reality, I suppose. And so oddly enough, I came back full circle to the ashram later on, after art school and travel and, a whole host of different lives. And
well, before you talk about coming back, so you grow up there, you go to high school. It's kind of as you say, there's an element of the ordinary to the practices, and then you go away. You go to art school. You're your own, creative freak and moving through, weird scenes. When you first went away, how much of the religious life of the ashram, ideas, practices, forms of experience. How much of that did you take with you when you went on you went to art school and stepped away from the scene for a period of time? Were you kind of rejecting it? Did you just let it go? Did it stay with you?
I think it was fundamentally hardwired into my worldview. That's a difficult question. It's like I was coming from so far outside the box that I think a lot of those years were actually devoted to a sort of process of being able to assimilate or to find to be able to kind of become a chameleon and move into these other worlds from which I had been excluded by choice sometimes, but also just by circumstance. So it was my a lot of those years were spent in cities, in different scenes, and so in terms of how I wasn't at that point continuing the practices that characterized my childhood, but I do think that there was a sort of basic presumption in how I approach life that was very much tied to obviously to those formative years, in terms of like my sexual politics, in terms of my perspective on power dynamics.
Well, say a little bit about that. Like, what would be those, either the sexual politics or the power dynamics, or they're probably related even. What do you think was informed by this experience growing up?
Well, I think that first off, I mean, frankly, I was as close to being a feral, teenager as you can get. And also I skipped my senior year of high school and then was off to art school. So right out of the gate, art school, and especially at the time in Memphis, it turns out after the fact, recently I spoke to the president of the art school in New York, and he basically, I just assumed that art school was the thumbs up for continuing a process of sort of radical experimentation. And we just pushed every conceivable limit that we could. Frankly, it was an anarchist experiment. And it turns out culturally, that was, I think, something that was happening in the Deep South at the time, which was, if you were at all out of the ordinary, you sort of ended up in a group that had a pretty intense solidarity. The dominant culture, it's funny, it was sort of a continuation of coming of age in the South, but in art school, it solidified and gave me traction where for the first time I found like-minded people, in as much as it was a joy in the experimentation and an embrace of being other or being peripheral or being, finding voices of outrage or reactionary voices. And so that existed. And let's see, to trace it back to my relationship to sexual politics, it was just, as I said, it was so feral, meaning like I literally grew up in the mountains playing with goats, and I just had a sort of a sense that if anything goes, like pleasure, I became just a unapologetic hedonist. I mean, it was just, let's try this, let's try that, if you're accommodating. And I didn't really have the same scruples or the same, I think, repression or a Protestant kind of conservatism. And that was mirrored in some of my closest friends. They were looking to break with their paths. And it's funny because actually my father ultimately was fairly conservative in those regards, but I think that the teachings that that sort of limbed my identity had within them a kind of radical acceptance of accommodation in the process of actualizing self and the search for meaning. So I kind of felt like I had a thumbs up for whatever goes, you know.
So you had a number of years of art school and spent time traveling in New York, love affairs, crashing and burning, all this kind of thing. What was happening in your life that led you to return to the ashram?
I had, at that time, I had come from New York City back to Nashville. My world had collapsed in many regards. The relationship had gone south. Basically, all of my artwork and journals were stolen in a tawdry tale that I still have moments when I reflect on that where it seems inconceivable. I mean, I essentially had the identity I had carefully constructed completely erased in terms of my work. So that sort of set the stage for a return to the ashram that had relocated to the suburbs of Nashville by that point. And there was a woman there who was my father's main disciple at that point, this incredibly beautiful woman who became a seminal figure in what became a period during which I had basically kind of came to the end of that chapter. And when I say that, I think what I would say is, so, and let me set the stage a little, in that my father had left for India. So that's an interesting aspect to this story as well. So my father went to India, leaving her in charge. I had come to the end of my rope, so to speak, and also had, flirting with various drug habits, and really had pushed the envelope as far as you can before before something breaks. And so I sort of licked my wounds, returned to the ashram, started, doing some of the practices that were incredibly familiar. Obviously, by that point, it was like kind of return home to some degree, but sharing those with Kai, this woman who was also having pretty profound and visible Shakti experiences. So she was there, and I started, return to these practices, and then consequently had a radical, let me turn that decline, had a very specific experience that I think was a turning point in the story up to that moment. So, and that, that was basically after, I don't know, a certain amount of time of being there. There was an evening in which we were in the small room where my father did a lot of very specific and focused practice. So it was a shrine room. There's the main shrine room, and then there's another small room that's just devoted exclusively to anustans, to very focused worship. And so we were in there, and she was in a state of possession or pure translation. I mean, she would go into these states where it was as if 1,000 watts of pure electricity were just radiating, just whiplashing through her body. But she was essentially sitting on me and in this state and just pounding my chest with the peacock feathers that my father usually used in Shaktipat transmissions. And at that moment, something broke within me, and broke, symbolically, metaphorically, not as if she broke a bone, but something broke. And essentially what felt like, I think, 100,000 years of dross came flooding out. I mean, you could call it perhaps in those traditions, the serpent awakens, the Kundalini awakens, and begins the movement up the spine. And so it's either like, the base chakra, there's a sort of moment where the Shakti is awakened. And I feel like there were moments prior to that throughout my childhood where I definitely felt this sort of stirrings of energy, a tightening in the neck, and a quality of, my breath seeming to take on its own logic, that had nothing to do with my will, so to speak. But from that point on, that led to a period in which essentially I completely checked out of the world. And by that, I mean, I stopped reading newspapers. And, by that point, I had spent enough time in cities and in the culture. I was, a budding cinephile and fairly well read, and, and had a love of literature and being a part of the underworld and the underground and those literary canons and those arenas. And at that point, everything sort of fell away. So I stopped reading, I stopped watching television or film or newspaper, like everything winnowed down to delivering organic groceries once a week to make a little bit of money for food, and then just these spiritual practices, and after that first break, there was probably a good month and a half in which I think I slept maybe, 2 hours a night. And what was happening was this energy that was awakened. So I was also having a physical relationship with Kai. So it was kind of a pretty remarkable, bizarre period. There was that aspect coupled with, essentially the days would consist of meditation, chanting, and then the energy would start moving in my body, and then it would lead to kriyas, or these kind of spontaneous yogic postures and vocalizations that could be anything from a high-pitched keening kind of sound that I could feel vibrationally kind of floating in parts of my body, to a sort of grotesque, guttural, what's the term for glossolalia, so it was just from day to day, the experiences were so gripping, and so it essentially swallowed my life. And I was incredibly sensitive to tone, to other people's effect. So I just cut it all out and kind of wiped the slate clean, I guess you could say. And so that became a sort of turning point in my life.
One question about like how your relationships, that you were also involved with Kai physically, right, whether like there was another part of your relationship that was kind of like, getting to know each other, sharing your hopes and fears, or whether like even the sort of relationship side of it was kind of subsumed by these larger energy forces and practices and such.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, at that point, she was 100% devoted to my father and to these practices. So interpersonal dynamics were without a doubt second fiddle, and That was, I mean, the thing that we were doing with each other was like sort of, it's what Kabir called the spiritual athleticism. It was like, I mean, well, maybe more within the ashram itself, but it was like people, the more mantras you did, the cleaner the whistle, the the deeper the dedication, the more perfect the devotee. Those were the things that were driving our relationship in that period. And it wasn't even, there was no real difficulty. This is the other strange part of that period, was it wasn't as if there was no, people try to quit smoking, or they try to change their life, or there's this sort of imposition of the will. The thing that was so remarkable about this period was there was no will on my part. It was a sort of surrender, and then a engagement that was I was so gripped by what was happening that things sort of naturally fell away. And then ultimately, when that shifted, that became the next chapter of my life, when what sort of emerged from that period, there's sort of more of an organic impulse, and even changed my relationship to the arts and into the nature of my desire, and because ultimately Kai and I ended up leaving that circumstance, and of all things moving in back to Hollywood. So I mean,
well, before we get to that, because I want to talk about all that stuff, but of course one has to rest a bit with the father. Sure. And right. You haven't talked very much about your relationship with your father, let's say up to the point where he's gone to India and you start having these transformations with Kai. What is your relationship like? How does it compare to what you would come to learn, other people's relationships with their fathers were like? Was it mm-hmm. distant? Was it respectful? Was it weird? What was that like in your, in your teens and early 20s?
Distant, that when you said distant, I mean it rang a bell. There was definitely there was respect. I only realized after the fact how there was a kind of the distance isn't the word. It felt and this is when you were asking about my relationship with Kai at the time, there was a quality to my father where in his path, his devotion to his teachers, to his spiritual tradition, eclipsed all other concerns. And that was never thrown into question. And that, coupled with a distance, like he wasn't an affectionate man. In fact, I don't actually remember ever having like physical contact with him, frankly. I mean, maybe once or twice. So I think he played the role of father in as much as he provided shelter and food. And there was also, but I think there was a quality in which we were the sort of first run for him becoming a teacher. We were students and disciples or devotees as much as we were his children, I suppose. So,
but when you got older, I mean, by the time you had left
right.
home, like, did you think about him as a guru? Was he a special person who had something that other people didn't have, or could you not quite ever buy that story?
I hadn't, the jury was still out. So I knew that, and as a child, when I was in the period, or maybe late teens, I would just lie about what my father did. So, in various circumstances, I would invent a life for myself, in which he was an architect or this or that, because it was just, I didn't quite even then know how to explain what he was. So, as I said, there was there's a whole aspect of the story of his relationship to my brother. They were much closer. I generally, was a mamoni. I was the mama's boy. And then ultimately my brother and he had some difficulties that precipitated a really definitive break. And somehow soon thereafter, there was a tolerance, there was a mutual regard, sort of affection at a distance. But in terms of his engagement in my life, it always felt like when he gave advice or seemed to show concern, it felt more like an obligatory gesture, because ultimately I knew that ultimately his concern was towards enlightenment. And watching him work with other people throughout my life, I there was a quality in which I was just one more person. So in his, I think in his philosophy, and in many things he referenced, it was, traditionally a lot of the sages or different teachers, even Christ denied his parents, and in his own relationship with his parents, there was a quality of a break in which you were sort of independent. Your path was your own. So I think he afforded me a degree of respect in as much as he saw my choices. He didn't agree with them, but it always felt like I was living a life concurrently, like we weren't sharing a life, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the inevitably the part of the the narrative question here is, what happens when he comes back from
Right.
India, discovers this whole situation, and also along with that is that how much when you got involved with Kai did you feel like you were breaking an unspoken boundary, or whether, on the other hand, almost just as much you could see it as a full expression of the whole energetic Shakti trip in that the whole thing was about. So there must have been a lot of, how did you think about what was happening vis-a-vis your father at the time, and then what happened when he came back?
Well, it's funny you bring that up, because I'm now recalling that there was a definite concern on my part, and also a fear, even within the processes that were unfolding. I was curious to see what would happen in direct proximity. I mean, ostensibly in the lineage, it was like he's Kai's teacher. He awakens her Kundalini. She's having these incredible experiences, and then I'm in an interaction with her. Consequently, I'm having these experiences, and then there was still a lingering, also this question of the father-son relationship as it's playing out within the ashram itself too. Like, would there be an egoic hesitation to worship him, to come to that place? Would these kriyas lead me into a space of a direct relationship with him as a student? So, and yes, I did have reservations in the sense that, as I said, there was a conservative aspect that underwrit. I always joked that my father was ostensibly a tantric practitioner, but a closet Vedantist, and there were jokes, and when he would work with people, it was always like, when you've passed on and you're looking at your past 300 wives, which one are you going to run to? There was and Muktananda had a little bit of that too, where your sexual energy was the source of power, and to lose a drop was the equivalent of losing, the jewels that you've spent a lifetime accumulating. So that underwrote what was happening with Kai. And we were also trying to practice. We hadn't committed fully to celibacy, and also there was this incredibly delicious physical, emotional, spiritual connection that was, profoundly sexual and also rooted in the practice, as you can imagine. So it's, we would both go into these states and then end up intertwined sexually. It wasn't necessarily in pursuit of the orgasm per se, but the sexual component felt like the center around which we were pivoting. And in any case, then my father came back, and I think he was surprised. And I often had the sense that throughout those years, I think he might have been as taken aback as anyone at the manifestations and how just outrageous some of these scenarios became. I mean, I can recall, and when I talk about that period, it's as if within those experiences, it wasn't so in Kriya, in those practices, I wasn't doing anything, but there was still a self that was bearing witness. So it was still like Naropa watching Naropa, which was really odd. There was no eclipse of identity as much as there was a sense of self watching these experiences unfold, as if, I was a guest in my own body, or that aspect of self. There was a witness throughout the whole process. And that same witness then watched my body, as it transformed into a cobra or spun on one toe, or, essentially there were periods where my body was doing these yogic poses or these asanas that I couldn't do if I directed my body to do, or the sounds that were being emitted, or, and so then my father returned, and then it sort of wasn't as big a deal as I thought. It just sort of continued under his watchful eye. And I think for him, it must have been interesting. He didn't express, concern or dissatisfaction with Kai and I's relationship. Though, as I said, there was a strange dynamic in that she was devoted to him. And then by that point, our relationship had progressed. So it had become starting to have aspects that reflected a more traditional relationship. So, I had to sort of defer to her primary relationship, which was with my father. And I could see the impulse in me to want to push that and see where her allegiance was, so to speak. I could already feel some of those kind of power dynamics play out, and that being said, back to the question of my relationship to him, it's oddly enough, it wasn't as if upon his return something radically shifted and it was like the guru has returned and consequently the Shakti transmissions sort of, doubled down, or there was a palpable increase in energy. It was sort of just a continuation of what was already happening, with an added degree of self-consciousness about the fact that he was there that was slightly uncomfortable, I would even say,
Well, we have unfortunately a relatively small amount of time left, and I want to be able to have a little bit of time to ask from this perspective now, looking back at the stuff that happened decades ago. One of the things that's always that I've remarked on with your story is that you had experiences that like thousands of seekers would give their pinky finger for. I mean, people want that like authentic immersion in unquestionable, Kundalini energy, to think about it in those terms, but just these profound kind of spiritual awakenings. And obviously you can't help but have some respect for these traditions because of just your own experiences watching what happened. It wasn't like the ashram blew up in some horrible scandal or some terribly cheesy scene or, anything evil or anything like that. And yet your own life, has had a very complex relationship with spirituality. Obviously, we can't go into that in the next, we have got like 5-6 minutes left. But I did want you to reflect a little bit on, after the fact, how you sort of narrated these experiences, how you saw them as part of a life that didn't stick to, I mean, like if you wanted to play the like, I'm a tantric guru's son card, you could have totally played that all the way to the bank, you yeah. So, but you didn't do that. And so that's what I'd love to hear you reflect on a little bit, is how, having had these openings, you kind of integrated them and also maybe resisted them or let them go as you went forward in a creative life of art and music and experience with people.
It's funny, even within, I think, tantric philosophy, there's a point at which, all things become the practice. It's funny, there's echoes in, like a post-Duchamp or a post-Cage kind of context where it's all art, it's all music, it's all spiritual practice. And so I think the transition from that sort of rarefied, closed world into the world at large there's been a beautiful and ongoing recognition of echoes and aspects from those experiences and from those insights into the world at large, that it's the ritual exists potentially to bring you to the experience, and then one realizes that it's all, there are aspects of ritual in all these acts of making the bowl. It becomes more of a Buddhist kind of practice of what you bring to how you rake the yard, how you interact with other people, and so I think I mentioned to you before, I'm still mulling over what happened. It's still there, and yet I don't have a formal practice. I don't feel compelled to. In fact, it seems sort of ridiculous in many regards to me at this point, because there's aspects. It's like, even when you do the 108 names of Durga or the 1008 names, it's that the Divine Mother exists as sleep. The Divine Mother exists as conversation. There's implicitly the idea is that the divine, or this aspect of consciousness, is within every experience. So there's nothing to do. There's no ongoing, I mean, everything continues to unfold, but I don't have a directive. I don't have an end goal per se. It's sort of hollowed out, it emptied out. Also in the process of the return to the world, it sort of was reinvigorated. It was the quality of the world. I love this idea that it's both illusion and isn't. I became much more comfortable with paradoxes, with even in my relationship to love, to other people. I see how quickly we reach for an interpretive lens to assure us that, like, this is a spiritual practice. This is how a relationship is supposed to exist. This is what is supposed to have meaning. Like, I can't, at this point, my practice is very simply like every lens of interpretation I reach for, I slips through my fingers and reflexively almost, so the practice is to be aware of that, and also sometimes to hold the lens a little longer so I can appreciate the minutia. I tend to be a systems thinker more than in the details, and so I am finding more at this point. Some of the details actually have a profound beauty, in them. It's the mundane. It's the kind of, conversation you have with a guy who's, a coal miner at the bar, and it turns out, there's a profound spiritual search within him that could be echoed by someone who's been living in an ashram for 25 years. It's the same story and in a different guise.
And then do you feel finally, just like we only got like a minute, but that you've become aware, since you've seen it for so long, of that you have an unusual effect on certain people, in the sense that even though it's completely outside of a formal religious practice situation, that you still carry a certain kind of energy that, whatever, dissolves things, puts new frames that are unexpected, causes energetic reactions that would normally not be there. Have you watched your life in that light in some ways?
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. I mean, be they strange coincidences, be it pushing people's buttons without intentionality, even by virtue of just a quality of experience or consciousness. There's, I've essentially am accustomed to being someone who galvanizes people, or a figure of controversy, frankly. I mean, even here in rural Colorado, it still exists. And, and also being aware of that, and doing diligence, and being more adept at how to help people's, what would I say, to play like maybe a bit of an informal, informal teacher, without necessarily the certification and the right hat. I do find myself engaged in those dynamics, for sure.
Well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. This was a totally fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you digging into the memoir books for it. So thanks a lot for joining me on Expanding Mind.
Thank you, Erik. It's been a pleasure, and I relish the opportunity to have you be the person that kind of unearths this story.
Great. Okay, folks, until next week, keep your minds open.